Okay, so hi, my name is Alex, and it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Animal Liberation New South Wales. So what I'll be speaking about today is often described as one of the most basic and uncomplicated things that most of us use every day: language. But it's really not as simple or as innocent as we think it is. And if you're anything like me, you probably use language to find your way here today. Because without it, and without all the symbols that we use to signify it, I really think that I'd still be waiting around at the airport. But I did make it, and I'd like to thank you all for being here too. And before we begin, I'd like to have a look at something together. Right now, in Australia, if you were to come across this puppy, covered in mud and tangled in bits of plastic, you would probably do the right thing. But right now, in Australia, if you were to do the right thing, you'd be committing a crime. And why? Because this isn't a puppy. This is a fox. And to transport a fox, even a fox that has been injured and needs veterinary care, or to care for a fox as a companion, like a cat or a dog, is a criminal act in New South Wales, my home state. Now, how can that be? How can there be such transparently heinous and contradictory laws, punishing people for what we would all do for a puppy? It's really rather easy. Call them pests, call them vermin, call them feral. Say those words and you're giving a green light to cruelty and standing by in the face of suffering. So, when I posted this on Facebook, I was hoping to help shine a light on what really goes on when we give others a label as deadly and dangerous as pests. So the fact that a pest control order, or a PCO, has effectively sentenced animals like this to death isn't something to be proud of. Rather, it should be something to be ashamed of. And this isn't theoretical. Just last month, this fox, Jorah, was killed. His family had rescued him after the PCO, meaning he didn't have a permit. So he was defined not as companion, even though he lived and was loved like one, but as pest. And this is something a lot of people didn't and still don't know about. And I think there are a few reasons for this. One is the language we use. We're using words and labels like pest and vermin, and then terms like control or euthanasia. The inevitable outcome is concealed. And another is the fact that those impositions of power or authority relative to our own promote a violent dichotomy between other animals and ourselves. So, this is a Facebook post by the Shooters and Fishers member Robert Borsak. In the video Mr. Borsak published, he explains that he personally killed the fox behind him and placed a native bird in the mouth. Now that is a motive that runs through so many of the images and ideas surrounding the demonization of so-called pest species. The target species is portrayed as a ruthless and murderous demon, preying upon our animals or our livelihood. So we read things like, foxes are not native. Okay, that's fine, they're not. But we could quite easily say that neither are the cows in intensive dairy farms, or the bodies that we call broiler that we kill in the hundreds of millions every year. But that's not really enough. And it presents us with a fairly unambiguous argument. They kill our animals, whether they be native or commodified property, and they don't belong. Ownership and the property system that all animals inhabit are the foundations for this. So the 1.6 million cows in Australian dairy farms and the 12 million hens imprisoned and exploited are exempt and erased from this equation for one reason. They provide us with utility, a value that we protect with law and force. And the language we use allows thought makers like Mr. Borsak to capitalise on common and taken for granted assumptions. Pests, not pets. Right? One is abhorred, the other adored. And I should be clear, this doesn't apply solely to foxes. There is no middle ground. they're either here for us to use or enjoy, and they are valued on the basis of this, or they are demonized and drafted for destruction. They must be managed, controlled, culled, harvested. Remember these words and take them away with you today, because they are all euphemisms for one of two things: cruelty and suffering. And in a sense, that's one thing that I would love for you to take away from today. Call bullshit when you see it, and don't be shy about it. Because each and every fox in this country is here because Europeans chose to import them to have a familiar creature they could recreationally kill. They were brought here by people to be killed. So we're threatened by those who pose damages to us. And this is as true financially as it is physically. And the animals labelled pests are placed firmly in a category, below even the defamed and devastated so-called farm animals on which they prey, and who we protect from anything and anyone but ourselves. So we're left with this: animals we don't own don't belong, and those we don't exploit have no value or utility. And those that have no value or utility are threats to cull, harvest, control. And this is the basis of the pest epithet. Because at least since Descartes, we've been busy creating and cementing these cognitive categories that separate us from them. But as good as we are at divorcing ourselves from other animals, the arrow doesn't go both ways. When we claim as a resource an entire gamut of species and disregard or literally destroy others due only to the body they were born in, the category erases any and all individuality. And that's not really a new thing. We do it to invented subcategories of humans, and we even use it as an excuse or an enthusiast to wage war. There are no individuals, there is only a mass. By repetition and relentless reinforcement, we are conditioned to accept a premise that is not only faulty and dishonest, but is literally designed and drafted for their destruction. And we become so accustomed to an idea, a practice, or a prejudice that it exists as a thread from our eyes, our ears, and our minds to the punctures, poisons, and traps that only and always will end in death. A good fox is a dead fox. I grew up with this phrase, and I didn't, for a second, ever really consider what it meant. I might be some kind of anomaly, but the ideology and the practice behind it is active. The individual has disappeared. Only we can exploit, only we can invade, only we can kill. And when the first word says we, as a total species like any other, did wrong, when we retrace our steps and find ourselves against the wall, we make it disappear. It didn't happen because we tell ourselves that it didn't. And it doesn't matter because we tell ourselves they deserve it. And we say it with words. And it reminds me of something that I read and then watched not that long ago. Throughout the book and then the film, there are quotes like this: "They're evil, evil, dangerous vermin. They're not really people at all. Dad's not horrible, is he? He's a good man. Of course he is. But he's in charge of a horrible place. It's only horrible for them. I'll show you what happens to rats who steal." Now, there's a theme there. We can see it, and we can probably sense it when we hear it. But for now, let's focus on this one. I'll show you what happens to rats who steal. Now, when I was preparing for today, I wrote a draft on Microsoft Word, and I noticed something here. When I wrote this sentence, this happened. Something was wrong with what I wrote. So I went to Google. I typed green squiggly line, Microsoft Word, hit search, and was told that it was a grammatical error. The sentence didn't make grammatical sense. So Word said if I chose that instead of who, I'd be making sense again. But I thought, what if I wrote the same sentence but changed rats to humans? Word said, okay, that makes sense. So what does that tell us? It tells us that aside from the comparatively more obvious examples, equating what is animal with what is inferior, this can be done at a level that removes their very being. That refers to things, right? Or objects. A human isn't a that. A human is a who. And because a human is a who, animals have to be that, below us in thought, language, and action. And all of this in a work of fiction about the horrors of World War II. I really think it says something about the embeddedness of an idea when it's thought so important, so essential, that it's included in the things that we make up, in our own imaginations. This is the power of language, the force of words, and what I'll be talking about today. Language and the ability to communicate in complex ways is one of our most powerful tools. Words support, maintain, and sustain culturally sanctioned control of, over, and abuse of other non-human animals. And with selective and deceptive use, it becomes a weapon. And along the way, I'll refer to tiers or categories of animals based upon how humans value them for their utility to us. I call these the companion, commodity, and uncaged. Because animals have always been there. They were there when we foraged first, and they were there when we built our first fences to keep some out and others in. Dogs have been beside us for a long, long time. A lot of us happily call them friends or family members. They sit on the first tier of the utility protection continuum. They have limited protection, but are considered sentient and valuable in and of themselves, and share a common home with many of us. We give them names. We remember their birthdays, even if we have to make them up. So, when acts violate our belief of what can reasonably be done to companions, there is outrage, vocal demands for justice. Now, some of us might remember the Wagga Council case from earlier in the year. Animals were left to die in freezers, in facilities we pay for. Even here, the impact upon people makes the headline. And when those responsible remain unpunished, we seek justice. But the further from friend we go, the more we become less guardian and more oppressor. We chose to exploit over coexist, and we did so selectively. We selected for prolonged exploitation, those that provide us with utilities that we value. This is the second tier, the commodified life. Here, so-called farm or food animals are valued precisely and explicitly for what they are and can become, rather than who they are and can or could be. Now, it's rare to hear of these species being doted upon like we would a cat or a dog. That doesn't mean it's not possible. It simply means that they are valued above all else for their flesh, fibre, or bodily fluids. And for a moment, let's think about that. If you're like me, you've probably been in a situation in which you've used words like this: flesh, fibre, bodily fluids. I think a lot of us have been in a social situation like that and used language like this to describe animal agriculture. And I'd bet high that when we do this, we are often met with disgust and probably censure. But why? Aren't we just accurately describing what's really going on? Of course we are, but collectively, as a culture, we've been so thoroughly conditioned to couch what we say about other animals and what we do to them in detached and ambiguous ways. This language permits us to consider other animals as we would a crop of wheat or corn or sugarcane. That's what the term agriculture evokes. We use the same terminology as we would were we farming beans or broccoli, when what we're really talking about is intensive and unrelenting suffering. And industry know this. Recently, I came across a paper published by the Poultry Science Association. They say that consumers are unlikely to want full disclosure of all aspects of animal production. And there is a real risk that certain realities of animal production would be aversive to consumers. Now to me, that's almost a given when their births, lives and deaths are combined into the term production. But the page goes on. As consumers who know certain realities, we may consequently refuse, as is our right, to purchase particular products. In the end, it comes down to dollars and longevity. The reason that they're worried is because the link between revealing certain realities, and we do this with language, may mean less confidence, less support, and less money. So my translation is this. There are things that farmers do that you or I would likely find cruel. If we know these cruelties, we might not want to support them. And we have that right as consumers, and how generous is that, right? It's amazing. But if we exercise that right too rigorously, we threaten the bottom line. Then we become extremists. Our right to refuse only exists if we take our cards off the table and back away quietly. It disappears when we tell others that the dealer is corrupt. So recently, it became clear to me that when we see an animal, we often only see what we think we see. It's as if the word pig punctures our vision and we see all the ideas, concepts, actions, or stereotypes before we see the actual living, breathing individual. We see a bird and we instantly recognize them as such. Flying with wings, we associate what they do with who they are and where they belong. They belong in certain settings. And when we see them in places we normally wouldn't, or we simply prefer that they weren't, they no longer belong. Here is an image most of us might think was what Hannah Arendt meant by the banality of evil. It angers, saddens, breaks, and motivates, but rarely will it shock an animal rights activist. When the image zooms out, it becomes out of place. By positioning other animals as matter out of place, or where they don't belong, what we're really doing is classing them as other, and usually as inferior. Not belonging means being outside, and being below the privileged position of human can be cruel. By using words and deceiving others and ourselves, it can be lethal. And this is even codified in law. For example, the enormous and retrograde Biodiversity Conservation Bill defines an animal as any invertebrate or invertebrate at any stage of development, but not a human. A human, by the definition adopted by this damning piece of legislation, is not an animal. It's amazing. And this isn't uncommon. This redefining to place a single species at the apex, master and commander of all others, has been built into our culture and branded into our brains like a forged ID card. If we scratch at the surface with any determination, the deceptions will become clear. Because our language has totally and completely divorced us from any and all other animals. Every single one of the hundreds and hundreds of billions of species on this planet. So when the truck toppled outside the slaughterhouse in Burlington last week, images like this rapidly spread on social media. It's not something we see every day. A solitary pig on a suburban footpath is rare. But instead of anything resembling reliable or accurate reporting, we're left with the hashtag #OinkEscape. Escape from where? Escaped from the void that is the world we have doomed them to. A world of literal and figurative darkness. A world of farms that resemble more factories than fecundity, and their existence as commodities that come neatly packaged in plastic on supermarket shelves. So by being positioned as so distinctly different to us, this individual, like all those that suffered both the crash and the interminable suffering before the final drive to the slaughterhouse, were captured and marched directly to death. The founder of the Canadian sanctuary, where Esther, the smiling pig we saw only a few slides ago lives, offered to adopt those who were so badly injured in the crash that they were no longer considered marketable. The slaughterhouse refused. And why? Because there are regulations and protocols in place that basically say that because their flesh, fibre and fluids is no longer worth even their place on the kill floor, they are literally worthless. So their value and their utility were so discounted that their lives became economically burdensome. And because of the mentality that brands them, literally and figuratively, as items, products, pieces, commodities, their place on this planet was literally torn from under their feet. Now, if this isn't one of those certain realities we spoke of a few moments ago, it's really, really hard to imagine what is. And if we're not shielded from these ugly, aversive realities with words, we're literally shielded with materials. The same industry journal, the Poultry Science Association, said that they wouldn't want to be seen hiding things from the public. It's better and easier to hide things in plain sight. With the things that come out of our mouths and what we write with our hands, we excuse ourselves of not only witnessing, but even comprehending what our words and language keeps hidden from us. But let's rewind for a moment and remember the demands for the cat in the Wagga Pound. That case led politicians to demand an inquiry into animal welfare violations. Now, compare this with a recent case in which a customer at an egg farm filmed and then reported chickens being mass gassed in skip bins. A customer tipped them off. This is an extremist, as I know none of us are either, but the legislation basically turned its back on the bodies in the skip bin and said nothing. This is where claims to sentience and utility become increasingly pertinent. Because it is a tragic cliche that if we did this to dogs, the cops would be called. But we do some disgusting things to dogs. We just don't give them collars or name them. So, by placing other non-human animals on tiers of utility that decrease in value the further we depart from ourselves, we create, legitimate and sustain exploitative and destructive systems. And this is rooted in language. When cases like the skip bin gassing are exposed, we're left to wade through terminology invented and redefined by industry itself. It even becomes our language. Euthanasia doesn't mean mercy when we apply it to animals. It has been utterly and completely torn from its roots. There are no sterile syringes, and there is no mercy. There is a bin, there is plastic, there is gas. So-called spent layer hens, first defined and then broken by the unceasing exploitation that has been the entirety of their lives. They're cervically dislocated or necked. That is, they're decapitated. They don't even need to be stunned before their frail, broken bodies are held, their necks stretched until they snap. It is, industry argue, a humane method of euthanasia. Orphan joeys are bludgeoned, bashed against bumper bars, or decapitated. The National Code of Practice calls this euthanasia. While the AVA, or the Australian Veterinary Association, defines euthanasia as a painless death, humane and in the interest of the animal's welfare, gentle, with a minimum of pain, fear and distress. For the joeys bashed to death on bull bars and the hens having their heads torn from their bodies, the pain, fear and distress is beyond my imagination. Recently, a puppy was found brutally bashed to death in a briefcase. Investigators labelled the injuries blunt force trauma. It wasn't euthanasia. It was the same act with the same fear, pain and distress, but meted upon an animal we arbitrarily say deserves better. The joeys are collateral. The hens are spent. For they are units whose individuality, sense of being, and ability to experience and suffer is erased. It's cold, calculated, and deliberately devoid of emotion. Do we get upset when a building burns to the ground and 400 units of stock are lost? Not really, because the language helps us stay a safe distance from that suffering. And do we get upset when we're told that there are huge livestock losses? No, because the way that we're told precludes any emotion. But that's not really true. Rather than framing the tragedy as it should be, we're exposed to language like this. The lead sentence says, the owners are reeling because millions of dollars worth of stock has been lost. Again, lost from where? The fated owners may have lost capital, but the so-called stock lost their lives. And more than this, the blame is laid on some external error. Forget that the pigs are there to be fattened to be food, and forget that the hands that led them there were human. So it's an exercise in professional and predetermined framing. If you want to dissolve or dilute responsibility, make it hard to place blame and don't name names. That's why financial losses trump lives lost. And on the rare occasion it does reveal itself, we're left with a rather different conclusion. Here, 10,000 piglets suffered an unimaginable death. Likely, they were burnt alive or suffocated in the flames. But it's the third paragraph here that says more than most. 2 locals said they simply couldn't cope with the sounds they heard coming from this factory farm. I didn't want to hear that awful sound. And who would? But who, in all their courage and in all their compassion, ever says a word for those that suffer? It may have been pitiful, but that's how you felt. So by framing so selectively, their lives and even their deaths are erased. But what are those that have little value or utility that we want or can use, either in friendship, flesh, fibre, or fluids? They are condemned to the borders and boundaries. They become the great uncaged, existing outside human control and providing little utility. They sit in a precarious and vulnerable position. As we've seen, through language they are demonized, and through this they are then condemned. Of the inadequate laws that exist for companion and commodity-defined animals, the uncaged enjoy none. While all states and territories have animal welfare legislation, they all fail to protect the welfare of animals labelled pests. And even where there are clauses that seem to protect the uncaged, there are codes of practice that override them. In New South Wales, there is a defence allowing the hunting, shooting, snaring, trapping, catching, or capturing of an animal, or using them as a commodity, in a manner that inflicts no unnecessary pain. That phrase repeats like a mantra. If we tell ourselves enough, we think we'll believe it. And a lot of people do. As all native mammals, except the dingo, for the time being, is protected in New South Wales, this ultimately means that introduced or pest species fall outside these already limited protections. And there are even loopholes in legislation protecting people who commit acts of cruelty upon them. Here in Queensland, it's a defence against the charge of cruelty if the murder is done in a way that causes as little pain as is reasonable, or if the so-called control complies with any other regulation. And in WA, it's a defence if the murder is done in a way that is generally accepted as usual and reasonable. Similar clauses exist in both the South Australian and Northern Territory Animal Welfare Acts, where it's either legalised cruelty or a defence if done under the guise of an adopted code of practice. As each code of practice begins with this passage, we might reasonably expect that they aim to prevent or curtail acts of wanton cruelty. But even here, and even though there is an expectation that suffering connected to sanctioned slaughter will be done in the most humane method available, they all too often fall back on claims of cost effectiveness or reliance on lethality. And this is couched in advisory, expectation-based language, rather than the more concrete or enforceable mandatory language. So even though consideration of suffering should be given, regardless of the impact thought to be posed by a pest, the model code of practice relating to foxes still advocates the use of 1080, despite admitting that its humaneness is still not really known. Anyone who has seen any footage of any animal suffering the impact of 1080 will and can attest against this. So, to me, it's interesting in some ways that the great uncaged are afforded such narrow and limited understanding. When we hear that they're not from here, it stings with a strange kind of species of xenophobia. Any historical account could and probably should conclude the same of me. So when the target species is spoken of as a foreigner or an invader, take a small step back. What's really going on there? Apart from an attempt to rationalize and thereby obscure their suffering and slaughter, they are positioned as impure. And to be impure promotes ideas connecting them to plague, labels like pest and vermin, and outcomes that can be traced from the bullet wound or the poison bait back to the beginning when they were branded pest. If it seems convoluted, it might be because it needlessly is. It appears to make some sense, but that's because we are, over time and relentlessly, conditioned to accept a premise that is not only faulty and dishonest, like I said, but designed and drafted to divorce them of any meaningful claim to sentience. And a lot of this is rooted in language. So while we all likely use language every day, it has power imbalances embedded within it. Today, there are countless animals fated for suffering and slaughter. Countless because there is no reliable figure or even estimate as to how many individual lives have been taken and will be taken by the ideology underpinning this pest epithet. And for many years, I never saw or felt the power that words can have. I lived like a blind sponge in Plato's cave, never knowing what was at times so close yet so far away. A couple of weeks ago, I was lucky enough to go to Canberra, and the wonderful kangaroo rights activist Carol Drew was talking about Plato. I'd never known anything about Plato, but this is really interesting. I suggest you look it up. It's really wonderful. So, while most of us know when language is being used against us, we react in different ways. I might get upset at something you might get angry about, or even ignore. But when words, labels, and even the structure of sentences is tuned to attack or deliberately denigrate other non-human animals, it often seems quite natural, even normal. The flesh industries have worked hard to make this so. Meat and Livestock Australia, or MLA, provide a glossary or industry-approved vocabulary on their website. Here we see heavy euphemisms, like the past tense verb dressed. We could go through so many of the terms provided here, but this one should suffice. Here, what we did this morning before we left our homes or hotel rooms means something entirely different and entirely deceptive. To be dressed is to be decapitated, amputated, eviscerated. This is all part of the sterile sounding system industry calls processing. Once cut, bled, and emptied of all organs, the body becomes a carcass. Not a corpse like mine would be, not a body, but a cage that kept the product before cutting. Temple Grandin, the designer and apologist of slaughterhouse cruelties, has even said that euphemisms like these work to deny the reality of killing. That's true, but they also work to disguise that reality when the once living individual's body parts are sent to market. If you use this method, by going through each of the endorsed terms, we can begin to bring what they're hiding back into the light. So despite Grandin's open acknowledgements here, elsewhere she has said that animals make us human, perpetuating that strict and violent dichotomy that has run through this from the start. At length, Dr. Grandin has said, if language naturally evolves to serve the needs of tiny rodents with tiny rodent brains, then what's unique about language isn't the brilliant humans who invented it to communicate high-level abstract thoughts. What's unique about language is that the creatures who develop it are highly vulnerable to being eaten. Here again, animals and humans are positioned as utterly distinct. Humans are brilliant. Animals are comparatively inane. Human language certainly hasn't increased our vulnerability to predation. Far from it. Our language has worked to conceal, soften, and distract us from that very vulnerability in those we label animal. It acts as a comforting balm that we wrap over our eyes to cover the blood with rose colours. So my argument here is not that language can't be rebooted or rewritten. It can be, will be, and has been before. We simply need to catch on to the lies. My argument is that we need to do this, and we should be doing it together. For this, I created an activist thesaurus. I've got a few here. If you want some, please come and get them. If you don't, if there's none left, we've got a couple, but hit me at, we'll go back to it. I'll give you my email and I'll send you a PDF. For this thesaurus, I drew heavily on a single book published on the power of speciesist linguistics. Because just as we need people who risk their livelihoods and liberties, and we so undoubtedly do, we need people like you and I, people at the proverbial front line, mounting everyday confrontations with that thing we use so often but consider so innocent and so banal that we don't even think about it. And we need people who intuitively or viscerally feel the injustices encoded into sexist and racist language. So many of the abusive epithets that run through these intersections overlap and intertwine that they lead and bleed into the other. So when feminists recognized the power and violence in words, they worked to bring what was hidden into the light. Because they knew that words can foster oppression or liberation, deception or truth. Speciesism and speciesist language hang like a cloth over our eyes, blocking aversive realities out and replaying comforting lies like a ricochet that rings around our mind. If the women's rights movement saw that language can be perverted and distorted against a single sex based on a born characteristic, we should really be paying close and critical attention to the words around us. Before we finish, I'd like to go through some of the rewordings provided in here. Okay, that's the email, sorry. If anybody would like a copy, like I said, please, I've got a few. I couldn't print as many as I'd like, but I would love to give you some. And keep in mind, some may seem completely alien at first, but that's okay, because as much as I argue against speciesist language, I still find myself repeating it, or tripping on some phrases that just don't come out right yet. And I've been practicing. Like when you call the body on the barbecue flesh, you're already bringing what was in the dark back to the light. But I don't think we should expect ourselves or each other to relearn the ways we talk or communicate overnight. After all, for the most part, we all grew up in a deeply speciesist culture. And as humans, we're sponges for the things and the words around us. But just as language perpetuates speciesist abuses, it can also be used to combat them. It will take time, but it must be done. This is one page from this little pamphlet. Basically, say what you mean. Bag, collect, cull, harvest, remove. They're all fairly innocent sounding words, right? They're all euphemisms that mean kill and murder. And the animals that are killed are targeted when they're referred to as game or nuisance or pest. It quite literally places a target even a price tag on their heads, which interesting then become scalps. And the hunts, campaigns, control programs, and poisonings are all done under official sanction or encouragement. Call it when you see it, because the words and ideas that mediate the world before us act to make the victim imaginatively absent, just as they are invisible when they become mere matter with no utility. The pigs so badly injured that they couldn't be killed and cut for human consumption were, for those brief and blinding moments, entirely visible. Behind the door to the kill floor, and behind the words that keep us a safe mental distance from that door, everything is dark again. When the kangaroo on the highway lays and languishes for months on end, drivers by likely see the words "dead kangaroo," not a kangaroo killed by a car, simply dead kangaroo. So it's not only the words we use, it's the way that we use them. Because like Orwell, who I love, I think he's amazing, we should remember that if thought can corrupt language, language can also corrupt thought. Because language embeds power imbalances, we can and must challenge and expose its deliberate and deceptive use. Together, I truly, truly believe we can be a primary force for change. Each of us can be a motor, a little crack in the wall that together tears this entire bloody enterprise down. In each of our lives, and especially in our daily interactions, we must use that unique ability we claim is so purely human, but don't even think about: language. To rewrite, we need new words. Forget free range. The more we repeat their frames, the more they embed in us and around us. What about less cramped, but still so goddamn cruel? It'll take some work rewriting this world, but because of the persistence and relentlessness of species as language, which not only denies non-human animals individuality and sentience, but uses devious claims of necessity coupled with a habit of blaming the victim. We wouldn't forgive this were it to happen to us or any other human community. Let's not forgive it any longer, anywhere. I'll leave with a quote from Joan Donaire, which is from this book. I strongly suggest checking it out. It's amazing. Every single page just leaves you with a whole new perspective.